The dust was a living thing. It coated her tongue, filled her lungs, and settled in a fine red film over the curve of her belly. Ilara had been walking since the sun broke the horizon, and now, as it bled orange and purple across the vast, indifferent sky, she knew she could not walk much farther. The worn leather of her boots was cracked, the soles thin enough to feel every sharp stone. Ahead, nestled in a shallow valley carved by a creek, was the first sign of life she had seen in 2 days: the dark, solid shapes of ranch buildings. A sanctuary or another place of judgment. At this point, she was too tired to care which. She did not approach the main house, a sprawling 2-story structure of hewn logs with a porch that wrapped around it like a possessive arm. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a warm, beckoning finger she dared not follow. Instead, her eyes fixed on the barn. It was immense, larger than any building in the last town she had passed through. Its shadow stretched long and cool in the dying light. Hay. Shelter. A place to be unseen. That was all she could hope for. She moved toward it, a slow, shuffling gait that was the best her exhausted body could manage, one hand resting protectively on the taut swell of her stomach. The air inside the barn was thick with the smells of hay, horse, and leather. It was a scent of life, of work and purpose, so different from the sterile parlors and stifling fear she had left behind. She found an empty stall, the straw on the floor clean and deep. It was more comfort than she had known in weeks. With a sigh that was half sob, she sank down into it, her back against the rough wooden wall. She did not have a plan beyond this moment. Survive the night. That was the only prayer she had left. She closed her eyes, the rhythmic sound of horses shifting in their stalls a strange and welcome lullaby, and let the darkness take her. She woke to the sound of a heavy door groaning open. A rectangle of pale dawn light cut through the gloom, and in it stood a man's silhouette. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, the shape of him filling the doorway. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around herself, a useless gesture of concealment. The man did not move for a long moment, simply stood there, letting his eyes adjust. She could feel his gaze on her, a physical weight. He stepped inside, his boots making a soft, deliberate sound on the dirt floor. He was not a drifter. His clothes were worn but well-made, his posture one of command. This was his place. She was the trespasser. He stopped a few feet from her stall, his face still in shadow, but she could see the hard line of his jaw. He looked from her face to the unmistakable mound of her belly, and his silence was more terrifying than any accusation. She braced herself for the inevitable order to leave, the disgust, the dismissal. It was a litany she knew by heart. "Ma'am," he said. The word was not unkind, but it was not gentle either. It was flat, a piece of granite. He gestured with his head toward the main house. "Mrs. Albright is putting breakfast on. There's a place set." He turned without waiting for a reply and walked out, leaving the barn door open behind him. The morning light streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Ilara stared after him, stunned into immobility. A place set. He had seen everything, her condition, her poverty, her desperation, and he had asked no questions. He had simply offered a meal. Tears, she thought, had long since dried up, pricked at the back of her eyes. For the first time in a very long time, someone had looked at her and seen a person, not a problem. Getting to her feet was an ordeal. Every muscle ached in protest. She smoothed her faded calico dress as best she could, trying to reclaim a sliver of dignity. Walking toward the house felt like walking toward a firing squad, but the man's quiet offer was a command in its own way. The porch steps creaked under her weight. The front door was ajar. Peeking inside, she saw a long dining table. A stout, gray-haired woman with a face set in lines of perpetual mild disapproval was placing plates on the table. A young girl, maybe 8 or 9, with dark braids and her father's serious eyes, sat watching. And at the head of the table, nursing a cup of coffee, was the man from the barn. He looked up as she hesitated in the doorway. His eyes, she saw now, were a startlingly clear blue, the color of a winter sky. They held no judgment, only a quiet watchfulness. "Come in," he said, his voice the same low rumble. "That's Caleb Thorne. This is my daughter Lily, and this is Mrs. Albright who runs this house." The housekeeper gave her a look that took in the swollen belly and the worn-out boots in a single, comprehensive sweep. Her lips tightened. "Sit," she said, her tone clipped, pointing to an empty chair. Alara murmured her thanks, her voice a rusty whisper. The chair was solid wood, the plate was heavy ceramic, and the smell of bacon and coffee was so rich it made her dizzy. She sat, her hands trembling in her lap, feeling the weight of their stares. Caleb Thorne picked up his fork. "Eat," he said. It was not a suggestion, it was a simple statement of fact. And so, she ate. She ate like a starving animal, trying to maintain some semblance of manners, but the hunger was a wild thing inside her. She did not look up, but she felt Caleb's gaze on her, steady and unreadable. He asked for nothing. He did not ask her name, where she came from, or who the father of her child was. He just let her eat. And that silence was the greatest kindness she had ever been shown. After the meal, as Mrs. Albright cleared the plates with a series of pointed clatters, Alara knew she could not delay. She had accepted his charity. Now she had to face the consequences. She stood, her chair scraping on the wooden floor. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice stronger now, "I thank you for your kindness. I'll be on my way." He looked at her, then glanced out the window at the vast, empty expanse of prairie that stretched in every direction. "On your way to where?" he asked. It was the first question, and it was a practical one, not a personal one. Alara had no answer. Her silence stretched, thick and damning. Lily watched her, her small face a mirror of her father's solemnity. It was Mrs. Albright who broke the tension. "Caleb, the girl can't just wander off in her state. It's not decent." Her tone was disapproving, but her words held an unexpected thread of pragmatism. Caleb considered this. He looked at Alara, his gaze lingering again on her belly. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a shadow of an old pain, there and gone in an instant. "Mrs. Albright needs help in the kitchen," he said, not to Alara, but as if stating a fact to the room. "Peeling potatoes, mending. The work is light. You can earn your keep. There's a room off the pantry. It's small, but it's warm." He wasn't offering a home. He was offering a transaction, a roof for work. It was more than she could have dreamed of. She could stay. She could be still. Yes," she stammered. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." He just gave a short, sharp nod and stood up, placing his hat on his head. "See to it, Mrs. Albright." Then he was gone, the sound of his spurs a faint, fading music on the porch boards. The days settled into a quiet rhythm. Alara's life became circumscribed by the kitchen, the garden, and the small, clean room that was now hers. Mrs. Albright was a stern taskmaster, her silence heavy with unspoken judgments, but the work was honest and blessedly simple. Peeling potatoes, shelling peas, kneading bread. Her hands, which had been clenched in fear for so long, slowly began to relax into the familiar motions of domestic work. She kept to herself, speaking only when spoken to, making herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. She was a ghost in the house, a shadow at the edge of their lives, and that was how she wanted it. She saw Caleb Thorne only at meals. He would sit at the head of the table, a silent, formidable presence, his thoughts walled off behind those clear blue eyes. He spoke little, usually to issue an order to a ranch hand who had come to the door, or to ask Lily about her lessons. He never addressed Alara directly, yet she always felt his awareness of her. It was in the way he would pause for a fraction of a second when she entered the room, or how his gaze would sometimes drift to her for a moment before moving on. It was a watchful, assessing presence, and it made her skin prickle. Her only real human connection was with Lily. The girl was as quiet as her father, a small, solitary creature who spent her days with her books or wandering near the creek. One afternoon, Alara was in the garden, pulling weeds from a patch of mint that had grown wild near the fence line. Lily approached, her hands behind her back. "What's that for?" she asked, her voice small. "It's mint," Alara said, holding up a sprig. "If you have a sour stomach, a tea made from the leaves can help settle it." Lily's eyes widened slightly. "You know that from the plant?" Alara smiled, a rare, rusty occurrence. "My mother taught me. She knew what all the plants were for, the good ones and the bad ones." From that day on, Lily became her shadow in the garden. She would watch, silent and attentive, as Alara pointed out yarrow for staunching blood, willow bark for fevers, chamomile for sleep. Alara found herself talking more than she had in months, the knowledge pouring out of her, a part of herself she thought she had buried forever. It felt like finding a lost limb. One evening, a chill wind blew down from the mountains, rattling the windows. By morning, Lily was flushed, her breathing shallow and ragged. Mrs. Albright laid a hand on the girl's forehead and drew back with a sharp intake of breath. "She's burning up. It's the fever." Panic, cold and sharp, entered the house. Caleb came in from the stables, his face grim. He stood over his daughter's bed, his large frame seeming helpless and out of place in the small room. "I'll send a hand for Dr. Adams," he said, his voice tight. Mrs. Albright shook her head. "He's over in Dusty Creek. Won't be back for 3 days. Maybe more. You know that." Caleb's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He looked at his daughter, tossing and turning in the grip of the fever, and Alara saw the wall he kept around himself crack. In his eyes was the raw, terrifying fear of a parent who had already lost too much. The ghost of his first wife, the one the ranch hands whispered about, filled the room. Alara's heart went out to him, to the small, suffering girl. She knew this fever. She had seen it before. She knew its course, and she knew what could fight it. But to speak up was to reveal herself, to claim a knowledge she had no right to have. It was to risk everything. She looked at Lily, her small face slick with sweat, her lips dry and cracked, and she could not stay silent. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He turned to her, his eyes dark with impatience and worry. "What is it?" "There's a tea," she said, the words rushing out. "Willow bark. It can bring a fever down. And bone set. To help with the aches. They grow by the creek. I can—" She trailed off, suddenly terrified by her own audacity. Mrs. Albright scoffed. "Folk remedies. We need a doctor, not weeds." But Caleb did not dismiss her. He stared at her, his gaze intense, searching. He looked from her earnest, frightened face to his daughter and then back again. He was a man drowning, and she had just thrown him a rope. He didn't care if it was made of silk or straw. "Show me," he said, his voice rough. For the next hour, she was no longer a kitchen servant. She was in command. She sent Caleb to the stand of willows by the creek, telling him exactly which bark to peel. She had him fetch the dried bunches of boneset she had hung from the pantry rafters. Mrs. Albright watched, her arms crossed, her face a mask of skepticism, but she did not interfere. Caleb followed Alara's instructions without question, his movements quick and precise. He was a man used to action, and she had given him something to do other than watch his daughter suffer. Alara worked with a focused calm she had not felt in years. She simmered the bark, crushed the dried leaves, strained the bitter liquid. The whole time, she spoke in a low, steady voice, not to Caleb, but to Lily, telling her to be strong, that help was coming. When the tea was ready, she propped the girl's head up. "It will be bitter, sweet girl," she murmured, "but you must drink." Getting the tea down Lily's throat was a battle. She was half delirious, pushing the cup away. Caleb held his daughter's small hands, his own large ones engulfing them, his voice a low rumble. "It's all right, Lilybug. You drink it. For me." Between the two of them, they managed to get most of the cup into her. Then, there was nothing to do but wait. The night stretched on, an eternity measured in Lily's ragged breaths. Alara sat by the bed, bathing the girl's face with a cool cloth. Mrs. Albright eventually retired, muttering about foolishness. But Caleb did not leave. He sat in a chair in the corner of the room, a silent sentinel, his shotgun resting across his lap, though there was no enemy a bullet could stop. He just watched Alara, his face unreadable in the flickering lamplight. She was intensely aware of him, of his stillness, of the tension coiled in his broad shoulders. They were two strangers, bound together by the flickering life of a child. Just before dawn, something shifted. Lily's breathing deepened, becoming more regular. The frantic tossing stopped. Alara laid a hand on her forehead. The skin was still hot, but it was damp. The fever had broken. A long, shuddering sigh escaped Alara's lips. She looked over at Caleb. In the pale light, she saw the exhaustion and raw relief on his face. He met her gaze, and for the first time, the wall was completely gone. In his eyes was a gratitude so profound it was like a physical blow. He did not speak. He just held her gaze, and in that silent moment, something fundamental changed between them. He was no longer just her employer, and she was no longer just a stray he had taken in. The next day, Lily was weak but lucid, asking for water and broth. The crisis had passed. When Alara came into the kitchen that afternoon, she found Caleb there. He had a hammer and saw, and a pile of fresh sawn pine boards. He was building something against the wall. He did not acknowledge her at first, just continued with the steady rhythm of his work. The air smelled of sawdust and pine resin. She watched him, confused. His hands, which she had only seen handle reins or a coffee cup, were surprisingly deft. When he was finished, he stepped back. Against the wall was a set of simple, sturdy shelves. "For your herbs," he said, his voice gruff, as if he were embarrassed. "So Mrs. Albright doesn't complain about them hanging in her pantry." Alara stared at the shelves. It was such a simple thing, a few pieces of wood nailed together. But it was a space he had made for her. A space for her knowledge, for the part of her that had saved his daughter. He had seen her, truly seen her, and he had built a place for what he saw. "Thank you," she whispered, her throat tight. He just nodded, picked up his tools, and left. But the shelves remained, solid and real, a silent testament. Life on the rocking tea slowly, irrevocably changed. Alara was no longer confined to the kitchen. She became Lily's companion, her teacher. They spent their afternoons walking the prairie, Alara naming the plants and the birds, Lily soaking it all in, her face alive with a curiosity that had been dormant for too long. Alara taught her to read from an old book of poems she had managed to keep, her own voice soft as she rediscovered the cadence of words meant to be beautiful, not just useful. Caleb watched the transformation in his daughter, and a quiet warmth began to thaw the frost around his heart. He started talking to Alara, not just about the household, but about the ranch. He would tell her about a stubborn new bull, or a fence line that needed mending, or the threat of a dry summer. He spoke to her as an equal, his thoughts spilling into the quiet evening air on the porch, and she would listen, her hands busy with some mending, her presence a calm anchor. One day, a new horse was brought in, a fiery gelding with fear-crazed eyes that had kicked 2 ranch hands. They were about to give up on him, call him untrainable. Alara watched from the porch as the horse bucked and fought, a knot of pure terror. She saw not viciousness, but panic. She walked down to the corral, her movements slow and deliberate. The hands stopped, surprised. "Ma'am, best stay back," one of them warned. She ignored him and spoke to the horse, her voice low and crooning, the same voice she used to soothe a feverish child. She did not approach directly, but walked the edge of the corral, talking to him about the wind and the grass, nonsense words in a calm, steady stream. Caleb appeared at the railing, his arms crossed, watching her, his face a study in concentration. The horse's ears twitched, his frantic movements slowed. He watched her, his nostrils flaring, his sides heaving. Slowly, carefully, she opened the gate and stepped inside. She held out a hand, not to touch him, but as an offering. He snorted, took a hesitant step forward and then another. He stretched out his neck and touched her palm with his velvety nose. A collective sigh went through the men watching. Caleb's eyes never left her face. Later that evening, he found her on the porch. "I've never seen anything like that," he said. "He wasn't mean," she replied, looking out at the darkening landscape. "He was just afraid. Sometimes all a thing needs is a quiet voice and a bit of patience." Caleb was silent for a long moment. "I suppose that's true of more than just horses," he said, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. The air between them was thick with unspoken things. He was standing closer than usual, and she could smell the scent of leather and dust that clung to him. He reached out, as if to touch her arm, but then his hand dropped back to his side. The moment passed, but it left a hum in its wake, a string pulled taut between them. The town of Redemption Creek was a necessary evil. Once a month, Caleb would drive the wagon in for supplies. Usually, Mrs. Albright went, but this time, Lily begged for Alara to come along, and Caleb agreed without argument. The town was a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings. As Alara stepped down from the wagon, she felt the stares. Whispers followed her like burrs on a saddle blanket. She was the woman staying at the Thorn Ranch, the pregnant woman with no husband. Inside the general store, a woman with a face like a clenched fist, whom Caleb addressed as Mrs. Gable, gave Alara a look that could curdle milk. "Caleb," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "People are talking. It's not right you keeping a woman like that in your home. With your daughter." Before Alara could flinch, before the shame could swamp her, Caleb stepped slightly in front of her. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the murmuring store like a razor. "Mrs. Thorne, my late wife, was a great believer in charity, Mrs. Gable. This woman needed help. I gave it. My house and my affairs are my own. Now I need 10 pounds of flour and 2 sacks of coffee." The finality in his tone was absolute. He had not defended her character or explained her presence. He had simply claimed her as part of his domain, under his protection. He had used his late wife's name like a shield, but the protection it offered Alara was real. As they left the store, his hand rested for a moment on the small of her back, a brief, solid pressure that sent a jolt through her entire body. It was not a lover's touch, but a gesture of ownership and defense. It made her feel safer than she had in her entire life. The slow burn of their connection deepened with each passing week. There was the evening he found her struggling to bring in firewood, and the next morning, a neat stack of split logs, enough for a week, appeared by the kitchen door. There was the afternoon she found him staring at a framed photograph of his late wife, his face a mask of old grief, and she simply placed a fresh cup of coffee by his elbow and left him to his memories, granting him the privacy he so fiercely guarded. He was teaching her to trust. She was teaching him to feel. One night, A summer storm broke over the valley with terrifying violence. Thunder cracked like the sky splitting open, and lightning lit the world in stark, blinding flashes. Lily, terrified, ran into Alara's room and dove under the covers, trembling. Alara held her, murmuring reassurances. A particularly loud clap of thunder shook the house to its foundations. The door to her small room opened, and Caleb stood there, a lantern in his hand. He had come to check on his daughter. He saw Lily burrowed against Alara, and Alara's arms wrapped protectively around her. He saw the two of them, a small island of calm in the heart of the storm. He didn't say anything, just stood in the doorway, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows. He looked at Alara, her hair down, her face soft with concern for his child, and the ache in his chest was a physical thing. This was what a home was supposed to feel like. This was the warmth he had been living without for so long. He wanted to step into that circle of light, to feel that peace. But he was held back by years of practiced solitude. He gave a single, tight nod and retreated, closing the door behind him, leaving them in the dark. But Alara knew he was standing out there, just on the other side of the door, guarding them. The baby came with the first autumn chill, a small, healthy boy with a tuft of dark hair. The birth was long and difficult, but Alara was not alone. Mrs. Albright, her stern facade finally crumbling in the face of life's raw reality, was a surprisingly steady presence. And when it was over, when the baby's first cry echoed through the house, Caleb was the one who brought her a cup of broth, his hand brushing hers as he passed it to her. He looked at the tiny infant in her arms, and his face was a mixture of awe and a deep, resonant sadness. The ghost of his own loss was there, but it was softer now, less sharp. She named the baby Adam. She was a mother now, and the ranch was her world. She fell into a routine of caring for Adam, teaching Lily, and managing the household, a role she had gradually taken over from an aging Mrs. Albright. The whispers in town had not stopped, but they mattered less. Here, within the boundaries of the rocking T, she had a place. She had respect. She had something that felt dangerously like hope. She was on the porch, rocking Adam, when she saw the buggy. It was a fine, handsome vehicle, the kind you saw back east, entirely out of place on the dusty track leading to the ranch. A man in a dark suit held the reins. As the buggy drew closer, a cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over her. She knew that man. She knew the self-satisfied set of his shoulders, the confident tilt of his head. It was Elias, her husband. Her blood ran cold. She clutched Adam so tightly he let out a small whimper. How? How had he found her? She had been so careful. She had thought she was free. The buggy stopped. Elias Vance stepped down, dusting off his coat, his eyes scanning the ranch with an appraising look. Then his gaze landed on her, on the porch, and on the baby in her arms. A slow, cruel smile spread across his handsome face. "Ilara, my dear," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "There you are. I have been worried half to death." He started toward the porch. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide. But where could she run to? This was her home. Caleb was out with the men, checking the north pasture. She was alone with Mrs. Albright and Lily. She stood up, putting herself between Elias and the front door. "What do you want, Elias?" she asked, her voice shaking but firm. "What do I want?" He chuckled, a sound that had always grated on her nerves. "Why, I want my wife back, of course. Our friends back home are so concerned. They all believe you took ill, that you wandered off in a state of confusion. I've come to take you home, to take care of you." His eyes flickered to the baby. "And the child, of course. A man must care for his own." The lie was so blatant, so audacious it stole her breath. This child was not his. He knew it. She knew it. But he would use it. He would claim it. Just then Caleb rode up, drawn by the unusual sight of the buggy. He dismounted, his eyes taking in the scene, the fancy stranger, the fear on Alara's face, the way she clutched the baby to her chest. "Can I help you?" Caleb asked, his voice deceptively mild. Elias turned, his smile widening. He extended a hand. "Elias Vance. A pleasure. You must be Mr. Thorne. I've come for my wife." He gestured toward Alara. Caleb's eyes flicked to Alara, a question in them. He saw the stark terror there, and his friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by a cold, hard watchfulness. "This woman works for me," Caleb stated. "An understandable mistake," Elias said smoothly. "My Alara is a compassionate soul, but she is unwell, prone to delusions. She ran away from me some months ago. I have been searching for her ever since. The law, you understand, is on my side. A wife's place is with her husband." He produced a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Our marriage certificate. And I have the sheriff with me. He's waiting down the road. I was hoping to handle this quietly, for her sake." It was a perfect trap. The law, society, decency. It was all on his side. Alara was a runaway wife. Caleb was a man harboring her. The baby was a complication Elias could easily spin to his advantage. She looked at Caleb, her eyes pleading. She saw the conflict on his face, the pull of the law against the evidence of his own eyes. He was a man who respected order, and Elias was the very picture of respectability. "Alara?" Caleb said, his voice quiet. He was asking her for the truth. But what could she say? "He beat me, he terrified me, he would have killed this child." It was her word against his, and he was a gentleman, and she was a fallen woman. The town already believed the worst of her. "I will not go with him," she said, her voice a raw whisper. Farif Elias sighed, a performance of deep regret. "You see? She is not in her right mind. It is my duty to care for her." He took a step toward the porch. "Ilara, do not make this difficult." To protect Caleb and Lily, to prevent the violence she knew Elias was capable of, she felt a wave of crushing despair. To fight was to bring ruin upon this house that had sheltered her. To surrender was to return to a hell she had barely escaped. She looked at Caleb's hard, conflicted face, at the home she had found, and made a decision. "All right, Elias," she said, her voice dead. "I will go. Just let me get my things." It was a lie. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and the baby in her arms, but it was a way to shield Caleb from the choice. She would sacrifice herself to save his peace. Caleb's face hardened. He looked from her defeated expression to Elias's triumphant smirk, and something inside him seemed to snap. But the law was the law. The sheriff was coming. His hands were tied. He watched, his face a stone mask, as Elias gestured for her to come down from the porch. Alara took one last look at the house, at the window where she knew Lily was watching, and her heart broke. She walked down the steps, a prisoner once more. Elias kept her at the hotel in Redemption Creek, planning to take the morning stagecoach east. He was smug, victorious. He sat in a chair, drinking whiskey, telling her how he would discipline her when they got home, how he would teach her to never run again. Ilara sat on the bed, holding Adam, her mind racing. She was not the same broken woman who had fled from him months ago. She had saved a child. She had gentled a horse. She had earned the respect of a man like Caleb Thorne. She would not be a victim. She remembered the saloon girl, Sadie, who worked at the hotel. Alara had given her a sachet of chamomile for her headaches just last month. Sadie had a kind face. It was a desperate chance. While Elias was pouring another drink, his back to her, Alara scribbled a frantic note on a piece of wrapping paper she found in the drawer. She had no ink, but she had a small pouch of herbs in her pocket, her one constant comfort. She crushed some bloodroot, mixing it with a little water from the pitcher to create a reddish-brown pigment. "My husband Elias Vance beats me," she wrote. "He is not the father of my child. There is a scar, shaped like a half moon, on my left shoulder blade. He put it there with a hot poker. Help me. Tell Caleb Thorne." She folded the note and tucked it into Adam's blanket. When Sadie came to turn down the beds, Elias dismissed her with a wave. But as the girl passed, Alara caught her eye and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod toward the baby. Sadie's gaze flickered down to the folded paper, then back to Alara's terrified face. She understood. With a deft movement, she straightened the blanket, her hand palming the note. She left the room without a word. Alara could only pray it was enough. Back at the rocking tea, silence had fallen like a shroud. Lily refused to eat, her small face tear-streaked and accusing. Mrs. Albright was tight-lipped, her disapproval now aimed squarely at the universe. Caleb sat on the porch, staring out at the empty road, the rifle back across his lap. He had followed the law. He had done the rational thing. And it felt like he had ripped out his own heart. He saw Ilara's face, the terror she had tried to hide. He heard her dead voice as she agreed to go. He had let her walk into the arms of a monster to uphold a law that felt hollow and wrong. The peace she had brought to his house was gone, replaced by a gaping wound. He could not live with it. The memory of his first wife's death had been a cold, hard stone in his gut for years. This new grief was a living fire, and it was burning him alive. He could not let her go. He stood up, his decision made. He would face the sheriff. He would face the law. He would face Vance. He would not lose someone he cared for again. Not like this. He strode to the stables, his purpose clear. He rode into Redemption Creek as dusk was settling, the lights of the saloon spilling yellow onto the dusty street. He didn't know what his plan was. A confrontation? A plea? He just knew he couldn't go back to the ranch without her. As he dismounted in front of the hotel, a figure detached itself from the shadows of the alley. It was Sadie, the saloon girl. "Mr. Thorne," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "She gave me this. For you." She pressed the crumpled piece of paper into his hand and melted back into the shadows. Caleb unfolded it under the light from the hotel window. He read the hastily written words, the reddish-brown pigment stark against the paper. A scar, shaped like a half-moon. He remembered an afternoon, weeks ago, when Alara had been reaching up to the shelves he built for her, and her dress had shifted. He had seen the top of a pale, curved scar on her shoulder blade. At the time, he had thought it was an old burn, nothing more. Now the image returned with sickening clarity. A cold, murderous rage, the likes of which he had not felt since the war, settled over him. It was a quiet, focused fury. He knew what he had to do. He walked into the hotel lobby, his spurs ringing on the floorboards. The clerk looked up, startled by the look on his face. "Elias Vance's room," Caleb said, his voice dangerously low. The clerk, wide-eyed, pointed up the stairs. Caleb didn't knock. He kicked the door open. It flew off its hinges and crashed against the far wall. Elias jumped to his feet, his face a mixture of shock and anger. Alara, on the bed, gasped, clutching Adam to her chest. "What is the meaning of this?" Elias sputtered. "This is a private room." Caleb ignored him. He walked over to Alara. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. She could only nod, her eyes wide. He then turned to face Elias. "Get out," Caleb said. "Get out of this town and don't ever come back." Elias laughed, a shaky, arrogant sound. "You have no right. She is my wife. The sheriff." "The sheriff can talk to me," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "But first, you and I are going to have a conversation. Downstairs. In front of everyone." He grabbed the front of Elias's expensive coat and hauled him out of the room and down the stairs. He propelled him into the middle of the lobby, where a small crowd, including the sheriff, had gathered, drawn by the commotion. "This man," Caleb announced, his voice ringing with authority, "is Elias Vance. He came to my home to claim his wife, Ilara." He looked at the sheriff. "He showed you a marriage certificate. He told you his wife was unwell." The sheriff nodded, his hand on his gun. "That's right, Caleb. It's a domestic matter." "It's a criminal matter," Caleb corrected him. He held up the note. "This is a message from Ilara. In it, she says this man has abused her. She says there is a scar on her back that he put there with a hot poker." A gasp went through the small crowd. Mrs. Gable, who had been enjoying the drama, looked momentarily stunned. Elias paled. "Lies. The ravings of a hysterical woman." "Is it?" Caleb's voice was ice. He looked at the sheriff. "I've seen the scar. I'll swear to it on a stack of Bibles. But you don't have to take my word for it." He turned his gaze back to Elias. "A man who would do that to a woman is a coward. A man who would try to claim a child that isn't his, a child born of a love he destroyed, is lower than a snake. This woman is not going anywhere. She is under my protection. Her home is with me and my daughter on the rocking tee. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with me. Right now." He released Elias's coat. The challenge hung in the air, thick and heavy. It wasn't just a threat of violence. It was a declaration. He had publicly claimed her, thrown his name, his reputation, and his power around her like a fortress. He had stood against the town, against the law, for her. Elias looked from Caleb's cold, resolute face to the hostile eyes of the crowd, to the grimly assessing stare of the sheriff. His respectable facade had been shattered. He was exposed. Without another word, he turned, pushed his way through the onlookers, and fled into the night. Caleb went back upstairs. Ilara was standing where he had left her, tears streaming down her face. He walked to her, his expression softening. He gently took the sleeping baby from her arms and laid him in the center of the bed. Then he turned back to her. He didn't speak. He simply raised a hand and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was rough, but infinitely tender. He had rescued her, not with guns or fists, but with his word, with his honor. And she, with her small, desperate note, had given him the truth he needed to act. She had rescued him from a lifetime of passive grief. "Let's go home," he said softly. The spring that followed was the most beautiful Ilara had ever seen. The prairie exploded with wildflowers, and the creek ran full and clear. The talk in town had died down, replaced by a grudging respect. No one dared to question the woman Caleb Thorne had publicly defended. Mrs. Gable even managed a stiff nod when they passed. The rocking tee was a true home now, filled with the sounds of a baby's gurgles and a young girl's laughter. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long golden rays across the porch, Ilara sat in her rocking chair, a mending basket in her lap. Lily was sitting on the steps, reading a book aloud to Adam, who was kicking his feet happily on a blanket. Caleb came and sat in the chair beside Ilara, as he did every evening now. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the sky turn from gold to rose. He reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. It felt natural, right? "I was thinking," he said, his gaze on the horizon. "The circuit judge will be in Redemption Creek next month. We could have him make it official." He wasn't looking at her, but his grip on her hand tightened. He was asking her to marry him. He was offering her his name, his future, everything he had. Ilara's heart swelled. She looked at his strong profile, at the man who had set a place for a stranger, who had believed in her, who had stood for her. She looked at the daughter who had become her own, at the son she could raise in safety and love. She had arrived here with nothing but the dust on her clothes and a secret in her belly. She had been alone, and he had made her part of a family. He had saved her from her past, and she, with her herbs and her quiet strength, had saved him from his solitude. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I think that would be a very good idea." He turned to her then, and the smile that reached his eyes was like the sun breaking through after a long winter. He didn't need to say he loved her. She could feel it in the warmth of his hand, see it in the way he looked at her, at their children, at the life they were building together. The frontier was still a wild and dangerous place, but here on this porch, with his hand in hers, Alara was finally home. She knew what it was to be truly safe, to be truly loved, and she wondered if it was possible for a heart to be so full it might just burst. As the first stars began to prick the deep velvet of the sky, she leaned her head against his shoulder, a silent promise that this was where she belonged, now and for all the days to come.